And a hint from Beijing on how it might respond to planned EU tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles. The Commerce Ministry maintaining it reserves the right to take action at the World Trade Organization. And for more on the emerging EU-China trade dispute, we're joined by Deborah Elms. She's head of trade policy at Hinrich Foundation. Dr. Elms, China reserves the right to file a suit at the World Trade Organization. These are protracted, convoluted affairs. But does China have a legal case?
Well, right now it's a little hard to say because we haven't seen the text released from the European Union about what has made the basis of their complaint. And so until we see that, it will be difficult to judge for sure. But I would say for China, one of the challenges is that the Europeans are saying that they have had subsidies for electric vehicle companies. And when those electric vehicles are then exported to the European Union, they are at a competitive advantage compared to those produced in the EU because of the subsidies. The challenge is that normally you have to prove injury. You have to prove that it's hurting EV makers on the ground in the EU. And that, I think, is going to be the weakest part of their case. Because instead, the EU is really talking about future competitiveness as opposed to today's competitiveness.
And that is because right now, the EU does not have a robust domestic electric vehicle market that can actually measure the degree of harm and therefore the commensurate level of tariffs that would be suitable in this context.
Yeah, I think that's the challenge. I mean, there are European car makers, particularly German car makers, who do make electric vehicles. But in a piece of irony, most of that manufacturing takes place in China. And much of it is for the Chinese domestic market, with some exports coming from EU car manufacturers back into the European Union. But domestically, inside of the EU at the moment, most of the manufacturing is for traditional gas-powered vehicles, not for electric vehicles.
So in making this case for tariffs against China because of its subsidized imports, what the EU is doing, as you say, is looking ahead to potential problems or challenges in the future and factoring that now into the tariffs that it does want to impose. Why should that be a problem at the World Trade Organization?
Well, I think because the way the rules are drafted, you have to be able to show that whatever subsidies or dumping of products at less than the cost of production is not just a problem, but it's actually causing direct harm to the domestic industry. If you can't show that, or you can't show it as carefully as you would like, then it's a bit of a problem. And so what the United States first and now the European Union are doing are making arguments about future positions. Now, they do so because they argue if we wait until the Chinese exports of, in this case, electric vehicles, have overwhelmed our market, then we will never have anyone to be harmed because it will be too late. So we have to act proactively now in order to preserve the space for a domestic manufacturing capacity to build up before we tackle the Chinese in our market. And so without that sort of buffer or that time frame caused by tariff charges against imports, we will never be able to develop a domestic industry that would be able to be competitive. So the European Union in this case and the Americans before them said it had to be about preemptive strike, if you will.
But surely preempt is better than dealing with a problem that becomes ingrained. The EU saw 10 years ago losing its solar sector to China. Surely it makes every bit of good sense now to prevent that happening again. For electric vehicles, it's considered a strategic sector. It's not just shoes, it's electric vehicles.
Yeah, I mean, that's the sympathy that you would have for the European Union or for the Americans or for others in this space. You know, if this is a sector of the future, if the technology is embedded in electric vehicles like battery power and storage, grid technology, et cetera, is part of the future, then you want to make sure that you give it a proper space and time to flourish. I think that the challenge is twofold. First, our existing trade rules are really about today's conditions, not about what might happen in the future. And even if you say, well, it's nearly 100% in the future, I'm certain, that's not how the rules are written. So we have a problem with the way the rules are written and the way that we tackle many of these issues. And second, and equally important, it's not clear, to me at least, that the solution that's being proposed in the form of higher tariffs is going to create the conditions that the European Union wants, which is that you start to create a competitive domestic market for the production of electric vehicles in Europe. So you've done two things. One is you've thought about altering the existing rule structure, and two, you've done so because you want to create an outcome that is different when it may not actually come to pass.
All right, the 2 points to pick up on. The first, let's start with changing the rule book. Now, China has warned of retaliation on French cognac, on German cars, on luxury handbags, if it sees the EU, from its point of view, tearing up the rule book, as it were, on global trade. What is to stop China from further breaking the rules of the trade, as the EU says it is already doing?
I think this is an open question and a concern, certainly being raised by Germany in particular, which sees its auto manufacturing sector based out of China at tremendous risk of potential retaliation by China and by those who could potentially, again, be in the firing lines, luxury handbags, agricultural products out of France. Now, why would China do those kinds of actions? Why would they then retaliate by raising tariffs, for example, on, handbags out of Italy? They would do so because they want those handbag manufacturers to say to first their Italian government and then ultimately to Brussels, what are you doing? This is not our problem, but somehow it's become our problem and you have to fix it. You have to deal with this electric vehicle issue so that we are no longer in the firing line of a trade war that we did not have anything to do with, So I think it's very likely, and this is what we're waiting to see, that we will have retaliation by China against the EU in addition to a WTO case, or potentially you launch a WTO case first and then you start with the retaliation. It's a little unclear how exactly this will unfold. But the risks are very high. The risks of especially escalation of this dispute into other areas that are currently not on the table, I think is a real problem.
And of course, retaliation in the context of, as you suggested in your earlier answer, we are not fixing the problem, which one side of the problem is this is a culmination of the EU's de-risking strategy in terms of cutting critical dependence on China for critical technologies. Does something like tariffs on electric vehicles come anywhere close to addressing that particular problem?
Well, I think part of the EU's answer would be yes, because it will reduce our dependence on China for this future emerging market and for all, again, associated markets that go with this, including battery storage, et cetera. So we need to act now in order to preserve our ability to compete in the future and to allow us to be independent of China so that we are no longer reliant on them for these critical technologies. We will develop them ourselves. We will work with, manufacturers in Europe to solve this risk challenge. But that is also complicated because one of the things that the Chinese are trying to do, many Chinese manufacturers, is to set up production facilities inside of the EU, in particular inside of Hungary, open up factories to be able to develop Chinese cars in Hungary. This is a very similar model to what we saw in the 1970s and 80s in the United States, when the Japanese were blocked from providing cars into the United States. At the time, the solution was to bring Japanese auto manufacturing into the United States, where it continues to be incredibly successful. And that is the same kind of model that many Chinese firms seem to be trying to follow, which is if you're not going to let us export from China, or in addition to exporting from China, we will also have production locally. And that way we can have models that are much, closer to the European market and so forth. That will get complicated. And so I think what we're also seeing is the beginning of a potential whack-a-mole situation where you solve one problem, let's stop exports of Chinese EVs into the EU. You then create a new problem. Now they're investing in the EU. So now we have to think about, well, do we have investment screening that we can apply? Do we want to think about components and parts coming in from China, batteries, panels, seats, whatever? Do we want to put limits on that? If we put limits on that into the EU, then do we have other places where we might have this production capacity that might then take Chinese components and parts and then route them through for certain assembly in a different region of the world to be shipped into the EU, to be assembled into a car, to be sold in the European market? I mean, this supply chain for autos is very complicated already, and it potentially could get much more complicated in the electric vehicle sector as well.
All right, thanks for that. And we're seeing that possibly already happening. China investing in Hungary and then selling on the European market. Well, thanks, Dr. Deborah Elms, Head of Trade Policy at Hinrich Foundation.